everyone. I'm sorry that for some reason the expected tea didn't show up, but I'm not altogether unhappy about that because I think um, in this university we keep scoring um, achievements and successes as was narrated earlier by our Vice Chancellor. So it's very reassuring to know that we are still in India, we are dealing with different departments and, tea may not show up. That's, otherwise you think you're in this whole building looks like some unidentified foreign object that's flown and planted itself in the fields of Haryana. And all the inmates here are like creatures in a zoo, especially if you look at it from the point of view of the Haryanvi village women who come to do the lawn and the gardening and see these students and, life here. It's really otherworldly. So I think it's nice to have some reassurance that, we are still in Bharat and, chai to kuch der se aayega, chalega. All right, so my apologies nonetheless. I would like a cup of tea because I'm suffering from a sore throat and all that, but we'll better get started, otherwise we'll lose on time, and we've got an excellent panel. I was hoping that since I'm chairing, and one of the things chairs do is not speak at all, but just manage the. But I've discovered that I've been slotted to speak on a topic. Now, Wenjuan is our expert on this topic. So, Wenjuan, if I'm unable to go on about it, I want you to chip in on this topic, right? So we've given it a very broad title, which is, comparing China and India on certain dimensions. And so let's start with something that's very concrete, important, current, all to do with trade, which is China, India, and how we deal with the WTO. And we've got a person who's an authority on the WTO, in my view. He's written an excellent book. It's extremely expensive. So you have to know him to get a complimentary copy. But it's very well worth it. I think it would do very well. His publishers are going to get rich. But it's an excellent book about the challenges of negotiating and the consequences of some of the negotiations we concluded, which are recent, which he will tell us about. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Sudarshan. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will confine myself, therefore, to India, China, and how these countries, missing my cup of tea, how these countries react to WTO, how they negotiate at WTO. So I'll begin with the membership of the WTO itself. India, we might have made a lot of mistakes when we became independent. One good thing we did was, regardless of the kind of international organization which came into being, including the International Refrigeration Organization based in Paris, of which India is a founding member. So we become founding members of every wretched international organization without discrimination. So one great benefit of this is 1947, we also became members of GATT. I also say we also became because China's membership was completely different, and I'll come to it in a minute. 10 minutes, Sudarshan? Yes. Yeah, thank you. So I think India was lucky. We were original members of the GATT, and therefore when GATT transitioned to WTO, we naturally automatically became members of WTO. China's case was completely different. I mean, they were not members, and then they had to apply to become a member of the WTO. And this essentially meant, Actually, they applied to the GATT, which then became WTO. So they took a record 15 years to become members of the WTO. No country has ever taken this long. I think maximum was 6 or 8 years. So 15 years is the time that China, and a giant economic power already, but it took that long to become a member of the WTO. So the first question is why? And the reason is simple. The Western countries generally thought, very rightly in retrospect, that this is not a market economy. So how are you going to admit this country into an organization whose underpinning is free trade? And then you have to tackle, essentially, those of you who are slightly interested in international trade, the most difficult thing is to calculate the subsidies. The most difficult agreement to interpret, it's not anti-dumping and other things, you have some indices. And if you don't get a product in China, you can always go to a relatively neighboring country like South Korea and decide the price and impose anti-dumping duties, even assuming you think China is not a market economy. But subsidies, you are not allowed to do that. So if a state is subsidizing a company, either on the sly or overtly, the WTO rules don't capture it. And therefore, this was already an issue, and this is one of the issues, therefore, that resulted in 15 years of negotiations with WTO to decide whether the WTO was a market economy or not. Finally, to cut a long story short, the compromise we did in the accession protocol between China and all the members of the WTO was that we will give it 15 years, and in 2016, we shall announce. The word used is shall, so it's quite a watertight thing. We said we will pronounce that China is a market economy in 2016. Now, it's another story that all the Western countries have gone back on that commitment because we feel that China has not yet become a market economy. Now, the way to interpret 15 years is the Chinese Communist Party decided in 1984-85 when they applied to the GATT that they will use the membership of an international organization like GATT and WTO to push through difficult domestic economic reforms so that the Communist Party doesn't get the flack and that you say, we are sorry, we have to do it because of the WTO. So this was a clear strategy on the part of China. And the other thing that gives you an indication of the Chinese will, if you like, if they decide this is in our interest, we need to get in, then time doesn't matter. That's a very irrelevant criterion for China, frankly. And in any case, time in Oriental societies, as you know, is not linear, it's cyclical. You can go round and round, as we often do in India, by the way, anyway. So I don't want to digress. So I think they took 15 years because they did consider that this was in their profound national interest to become part of the multilateral trading system. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is when I left Geneva in 2001 after after the Doha run was launched, the Chinese would be absolutely quiet in meetings, no English. We are here to learn. You Indians speak so well. You can speak for us. This went on for 3-4 years. For 3 to 4 years, the Chinese would not speak, and they would say to the normally loquacious Indians, garrulous Indians like me, so they would say, no, you speak. You're good at this, and we are quite happy to go along with you. They did that. And then within 5 years, we saw a new breed of Chinese diplomats come to Geneva. Everybody 30s, and suddenly everybody says, we got a degree from Harvard, got from Yale, MIT, international trade. And then we started having people from Bihar and southern states whose accent became gradually worse, and their accent becoming gradually better. So I'm making a bit of a joke of this, but the roles really got reversed. We had a completely different set of diplomats coming in, and they had a completely different set of diplomats, again, telling you something about the will of the Chinese government. Once they decide this is important, we will train these people, and of course they're not obliged to go through the same procedures as we are. So, you have to put in 20 years to become a joint secretary, to become an ambassador, you have to lose considerable hair, put on weight, all sorts of things. These things don't apply to them. So they were quite it was quite convenient. So that's the other thing I want to know. The third thing is, which is really, I'm trying to, confine to the limit, Sudarshan, the approach. So the approach to developing countries, it's very interesting. China, of course, came in saying, we are a developing country, but in the accession protocol that China signed with the WTO, they already gave up their developing country status in some areas, not all areas across the board, but in some areas they were steamrollered by the Western countries, particularly the US, into saying, no, you are not a developing country. So the informal understanding was, if your share of world trade is more than 3% in a particular sector, you will give up your developing country status, something which is coming back to haunt India now. Because in gems and jewelry, in textiles, there are a few areas, very few I must say, but areas in which India has more than 3% of the global share of trade. But China had in quite a few sectors, and so this also shows to you China's pragmatism. It's not as if they come with a point of principle that no, my way or the highway. They really negotiated, and they were happy to give up their developing country status in some sectors as part of their accession protocol. The other thing is that China would never do the kind of things India does, which is like-minded groups. India would get together a bunch of people, countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and most of these countries are closer to China than India. But we would get together these countries and say, like-minded group, and India is the leader of the developing countries and so on. China had no pretensions to that. I think for at least 10 years after their accession to the WTO, they hid behind us. They allowed us to take the leadership in developing countries. They quietly sat behind and said, yes, we are a developing country. We are happy to support you. Somewhere along the way, when it came to Bali, and I'm jumping ahead now, you got the Cancun meeting and the Bali meeting when agriculture became very important. Then I think India started imitating China a little bit. We deserted our usual constituency of G77 and started saying there are a bunch of 20 countries which are interested in agriculture, and China, India will provide the leadership. Now, there is a debate in India as to whether this was the correct decision to make. You got two views, obviously. One, agriculture was so important for India, we wanted to have China on our side. And the negotiating history tells you that if India and China are together, it's very, very difficult for the United States and EU to kind of steamroller us, frankly. Otherwise, they would have done it very easily with India as they did in the Uruguay round. So I think we did this. I would say to some extent the developing countries then started, they would make a joke of it by telling us, oh, now you've become a great power, you are now in the company of China and so on. We would say, no, it's a marriage of convenience, it's issue-based, just agriculture and so on. So that's one thing I wanted to say as well. The other thing about China is their propensity to do bilateral deals with the United States. Because really it became obvious after 10 years in the WTO that at least in trade terms, China did not consider India as its equal. Justifiably, in my view. I mean, where is 14 billion GDP and where is 2.7? So, trillion, sorry. Trillion. Three? Okay. Thank you. We will round it off and say 3. But even so, 3 trillion to 14 trillion, really no comparison. So China knew its place under the sun. And the gradual, there used to be a quadrilateral in the WTO, the GATT, which was essentially US, EU, Japan, Canada. And now the quad in the WTO is US, EU, Japan, China. Canada has dropped off because obviously nobody really bothers that much about Canada anymore in the WTO, but it is China. And India often is associated with this grouping because we still have a lot of nuisance value. We can block things in the WTO. I'm putting it bluntly because we're still a big market. I mean, the real leverage for India, unlike China, and it's a very interesting comparison, China's market for many of these things is already saturated. It is the Indian market which is virgin and unexploited. So if Gucci, Prada, how many Rolex watches can the Chinese buy? There are quite a few Chinese who already have a Rolex watch. You don't buy a second Rolex watch. Those of you who know Rolex know, you might go on to buy a Patek Philippe, but you're not going to have 2 Rolex watches. So I think India is the virgin market. So in WTO, the real leverage for India actually comes from the fact that we still have, I believe we have 200 million, but some would say 300 million people who can buy all these luxury goods. I mean, any interest by the external world in India is restricted to this 200 million people. We should not kid ourselves that the outside world is interested in 1.3 billion people. No, that's your problem. It's not their problem. They're interested in the 200 million who possess this massive purchasing power with which they can get goods of luxury which are being sold by these companies. And you can talk about BMW, you talk of French wine, you talk of the watchmakers, it's the same thing. Last point, since you're looking sternly at me. So, I realize, I know you by now. Give me 1 minute more. The approach to plurilateral negotiation. So WTO and the MFN-based system is drawing to a close. I don't want to say it's dead, very close to being comatose. And the name of the game is free trade agreements and plurilateral negotiations. India is still continuing with the old logic of saying no to plurilateral negotiations. So we don't participate in the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce in the WTO. We don't participate in the plurilateral negotiations on investment facilitation. We don't participate in the trade and trade services negotiations. We don't. All these things, I mean, this is the old Indian thing. You need policy space. You need to keep, why do you want to have a multilateral constraint? Same thing. I mean, part of the logic applied to RCEP as well. But anyway, so in contrast, China participates in all plurilateral. I thought it was a bit rich that China, which doesn't even allow Google and Amazon, and we heard from a speaker in the previous session, they don't even allow these tech companies in their market. They have now become a party to the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce. I'd love to know how they would negotiate this, frankly. What is there to negotiate? They've got Alibaba, they've got WeChat, basically telling Google and Amazon, take a walk. How are you going to negotiate this? It'll be interesting. No, it'll be interesting for me. And India, which has provided a free-for-all for all these tech giants so far, we are kind of sheepish and saying, we don't know, we will wait and see. So I'm going to stop here. Free trade agreements, again, same story. We are a lot more defensive. To a great extent, just three things, if you don't mind. One, the will of the Chinese Communist Party, which runs through the negotiators. If the decision is made, it's made. And then only the outcome. By the way, their negotiating positions are not like India. There's a fundamental difference. India's position is try to prevent something from happening. Their negotiating position is get a positive outcome which is in the interest of China. Big difference. And they will do anything to get that outcome. Whereas we are trying to block things. So by definition, we only know what we don't want and the Chinese know what they want. So there's a fundamental difference. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. This is a panel with my Vice Dean, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, so it's always a privilege to share speaking time with him because he brings a lot of technical expertise. But I am going to move away from trade, although this the element of trade and investment is interlinked with foreign assistance. In fact, mea culpa for the title, because neither India nor China actually uses the term foreign aid. But I wanted to be absolutely crystal clear from a reader's point of view as to what we mean by because each of them, in fact, both of them call it development partnership cooperation, development cooperation or development partnership. So, and presumably it's a kind of an anti-colonial vision that we don't do aid and we actually assist other developing countries in the spirit of South-South cooperation. Both of them say that, but I'm going to speak about the significant differences between these two on this element, and it's worth pondering as to why they are different. First of all, I mean, if you just look at the statistics in terms of volume, Ambassador Mohan Kumar is talking about just the GDP sizes. The difference in the overseas assistance or development part or foreign aid, let's say for simplicity, is phenomenally high. It's more than the factor of the difference between the GDPs of the two countries. So 3 trillion to 14 or 15 trillion is one-fifth of the, India is one-fifth of China's GDP. But if you look at the overall volumes of foreign assistance that the two countries do, India is like close to no more than 2 billion if you add of money here and there. I'm talking of US dollars. Yeah. While the Chinese range anywhere between 35 to 50 or more. At one point in, before the economic crisis of 2008, they were even running in the 60 and 70 billion dollars per annum is what they were giving out in various forms. And I will not go, given the time constraints, unpack this term, because there are loans in it, there are grants, there are low interest loans, there are non-concessionary forms of finance, all kinds of things lumped onto this category. In fact, the Chinese total assistance is ahead of that of the United States, at least in the last few years. And especially if you include loans. If you don't and you only look at grants, then probably US is still ahead. So the China is a big donor. That's the number one point. And China is a much bigger donor than India is. Right? And likewise, if you look at the geographical spread of the foreign assistance of the two countries, China, if you look at the cluster, the research is showing that the majority of its foreign assistance, grants, loans, plus / other forms of assistance that lead to economic activity, it's largely concentrated in Africa, but it also includes Latin America to a lesser extent, and even Eastern and Central Europe. They have this 16+1 engagement policy with poorer countries of Europe. So, and of course, they have their own neighboring countries, which some of which, for example, you look at the CLMV countries in ASEAN, which are poorer countries. So China gives plenty to many of these countries. But Africa, if you look at is the largest cluster. But they, in terms of loans, they give out to some special partners. Russia gets a lot, and so does Pakistan. These are two big players apart from Africa. India, as you know, if the pool to give out itself is somewhat limited, the geographical spread is obviously also limited, right? So the bulk of the Indian assistance goes to South Asian countries, especially Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Maldives, and so on, to a lesser extent Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So the vision, if you look at it just gives you a sense of the vision of these two countries. China, because of its surplus to give out, is much more global. And Indian assistance to Africa or Latin America is, relatively speaking, peanuts. Yeah. But of course, not everything is measurable in terms of pure monetary value, and I'll come to that when I discuss the impact of these two countries. Next, what is the difference in the philosophy and the purpose of the foreign aid? This is the most central question. Why do they give this aid at all? Both of them, in fact, India graduated to becoming a net giver of foreign assistance only in 2016-17. Until then, we were a net recipient. The Chinese graduated long past that stage, long ago, and by some yardsticks, they give out more official development assistance and other forms of assistance than the World Bank Group, for example, the entire World Bank Group, which is a multinational lending agency. So why have both these countries become net givers? It's quite obvious. I mean, there is a clear strategic purpose behind it. It's not altruism, right? Nobody gives out aid in foreign relations simply because we are do-gooders or good Samaritans. So what is the strategic purpose of the two countries? The Chinese case, it was very closely linked to its economic growth model. Indian case, not so much. So what do I mean by linked to economic growth model? China's fundamental problem over the last 20 years has been overcapacity in construction, in manufacturing, in large-scale infrastructure products. So China has been looking for ways to be able to find takers for this overcapacity and to solve its overcapacity problem, and which is one of the main reasons it's gone out in such a big way. globally. And therefore, you find, be it the BRI or be it other forms of, bilateral, or they have with the African group, they have a annual engagement with the entire group where they keep on announcing more lines of credit and more forms of assistance. In all these cases, is closely linked to the economic growth. Initially, it was linked to resources, to natural resources, and to be able to have captive access to lock in secure minerals and oil and other forms of energy. This was one of the major motivations for the Chinese to give out assistance, right? Quid pro quo. Look at a country like Angola in Africa. You get a sense, major oil producer. Why is China doing so much there? It's closely linked to energy security for China. Later on, as it went up the value chain, and especially in the last few years, there is a talk that the Chinese focus is less on energy and on minerals and more on IPR. So that's why the 16+1 program, actually, if you study that carefully, and in Europe, it seems like they are more interested in high technology rather than raw materials and minerals or commodities. So that has been one big shift, and you can clearly correlate the shift in their attention to other regions of the world. Africa, by the way, in the last couple of years, the data is showing that Chinese assistance to Africa is declining in absolute terms and also as a percentage of total aid. And this might mark a shift away from that old resource-driven model of aid towards one that is looking at high-tech and acquiring more and more proprietary knowledge, which will help them to go up the value chain. And then, of course, the third purpose is geopolitical influence. And China is a great power already by most yardsticks. Most IR scholars agree that it's a great power, or in layman's parlance, a superpower today. And it looks at building relationships with some geopolitically vital countries in its own neighborhood. For example, you look at this, again, I go back to CLMV countries. It's very critical for them to maintain assets in ASEAN through assistance. So a poor country like Cambodia, for example, receives massive sums of Chinese assistance in different forms. And this helps to entrench the Chinese influence in this region and to also divide the field in case there is any opposition to China's expanding role. So it's supposed to be a softening blow. The aid is supposed to also enable China's power to keep on growing. Now, coming to the Indian case, the vision, as I said, is more South Asia-centric. And because they don't have vast sums to give out as lines of credit or as grants, we look at money plus other things. So increasingly, it has become centered around capacity building and human resource building. And the vision and the purpose seems to be very clearly to strengthen countries which are politically and geopolitically important for us. Afghanistan is a classic example, right? It's vital for India's national security. There's no big economic need for us to give out this kind of money and rebuild places in Afghanistan. It's very closely linked to our geopolitical requirements. So China does that too, but seems to me, from the choice of countries that India focuses on, Maldives, for example, we were unwilling to give out aid as long as there was a regime that was seen as unfriendly to India. And once there was a democratic change, was it last year, 2018, and a new regime came in the Maldives, we opened the spigots as much as we could. So it's clearly based on the idea that Indian Ocean region, South Asia, these are the critical areas. With Africa, it's lesser. It's lesser, far lesser. So the purpose, what is the purpose of Chinese aid? According to the critics, it is hegemony. Some form of hegemony or the other, right? You hear that a lot. Even in our country, many people believe that. People talk about the debt colonialism of the BRI and of the CPEC and many other projects that they do. And people talk about how some of these have no longer got any economic purpose because they seem to be dwarfed by other needs to counterbalance other countries and so on. For example, CPEC probably does not resolve any major economic need of China, but it's geopolitically important because they want to counterbalance India and keep Pakistan stable and solvent somehow or the other, or running without collapsing. But so if hegemony is one of the purposes, at least that's what the critics of the Chinese say. No, well, look, we have trade, we have commerce, we have expanding spheres of interest globally because we are all over the place, and we do South-South. We believe in a multipolar world order. We are building up, developing countries so that they can be freed from the pressure of the West. There's an anti-hegemonic. They say it's an anti-hegemonic purpose. Ultimately they say it's not conditional. For example, they say, that's one of the big things. The Chinese aid is always, they say, it's not conditional. We don't impose any human rights or democracy or environmental or labor or other conditionalities. We just give to whoever needs. At least that's what they say. So there is that whole narrative of it being anti-hegemonic. Although increasingly, if you look at the cases of, in this region, people talk about Hambantota and Gawadar and Kyaukphu in Myanmar. You look at those three, all of them built with Chinese assistance, but increasingly likely to be taken over on a full-time basis by China for other purposes, presumably. So there is a undercurrent of suspicion about what China does. And that probably has to just do with its size and its ambition to be a superpower. Indian purpose, as I said, is more limited and more protective of its sphere of influence, which is in the Indian Ocean and South Asia. Last, what is the impact? What is the impact of Chinese assistance? The Chinese assistance clearly has built up infrastructure of some very, very least developed countries. And in fact, the critics of Chinese aid sometimes forget that the recipients, especially the elites in the recipient countries, sing praises of China a lot. Jakaya Kikwete, the former Tanzanian prime minister, once said, look at all the hospitals in my country, the health centers, every one of them has been built by the Chinese. And then he says, look at the nurses and the doctors and other helping personnel, most of them have been trained by the Indians. That seemed to neatly set up the distinction between the aid models of the two countries. But it's driven by differences along all these axes. One might argue and reduce all this to say, look, if India had more money to give out, if India was more industrialized, if India had overcapacity, if India was a $14 trillion economy as opposed to $3 trillion, maybe we would also behave the way the Chinese are. And maybe the differences would be somewhat lessened. But then, this, as they say in the South-South cooperation model, they say there's a multiplicity of modus operandi and multiplicity of philosophies and multiplicity of visions. For example, the Brazilians, Brazil is another interesting case I cannot bring in due to paucity of time. They have a totally different philosophy when they do South-South cooperation in Africa, especially until the current regime has come in. So I'm just laying out the variation for all of us to reflect on. If you go by a purely materialistic explanation of the difference, it all boils down to which is a bigger economy, which is a bigger power, and therefore they behave in this fashion. That's the generalization you could make. But once you get into nuances, you might find that in some cases, India is actually more geopolitical in its aid strategy, while China is probably less geopolitical, or maybe it's a mix. So let's follow. If those of you interested in this, I suggest you follow this DPA. Our MEA has a DPA section, but although there are pools of aid scattered here and there, and not all of them can be tallied together, but then the Chinese now have set up their own such vehicle called CIDCA, China International Development Cooperation Agency. There's going to be a lot of competition in some areas between the two countries, but then there are others where the Chinese are clearly ahead, but also facing more blowback and criticism by virtue of being big. So India can at most take comfort in the fact that we are smaller and therefore facing lesser flack. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chair Dean Sudarshan. And it's truly an honor being here, despite I have nothing to do with China. So I take a caveat that my vantage is global law and policy, And China is just a case in point. And through this, I don't want to puff and pan through through an extempore. So I have a structured presentation that at times I need to rely on this. So first of all, my presentation, I've named it Global Law and Policy. Chinese and Indian approach to global law and policy and exploring the spaces of cooperation. So first of all, let me make an effort to conceptualize the global law and try to differentiate that from international law. There at times seem to be a confusion because I'm going to take the Chinese position on the global law and later on the Indian position in order to draw the parallels. Global law is in fact law of the late modernity. It is the law that came into existence after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a law governing pluralities. It governs the blissful indeterminacy. It's general in scope and particular in application. It exists on this linearity, the horizontal linearity of local, national, and international. Well, the vertical the structure has collapsed, and now it has given for a horizontal linearity whereby it's national, local, and the international. Now, unlike international law, the global law helps states to particularize their domestic interests, retaining power with the states, while horizontally allocating power within this horizontal linearity of local, national, and international. Global law is the law of the political economy. Global law is both rationalist in character and realist in nature. So if so, what exactly is that relationship between global law and what is generally termed the public international law? As I've mentioned that the horizontal linearity of local, national, and international roll into one actually to become the global. It is actually the horizontality which is giving an identity or an epistemological status to global law as a discipline. It is a late modern adaptation of many of the fundamental principles of public international law, but it's least bit normative in character. This is of extreme implication for China as a state and Chinese approach to global law and policy. So the dynamic and provisional character of the global law is such that it doesn't need a normative legitimacy to sustain. Its legitimacy is the political efficacy and the policy interventions it gets. Global law, as I said, it's not legitimized by any kind of a normative system or a normative policy, but by policy systems and by the appropriateness of the relevant policies and the favorable outcomes it fetch. When it comes to Chinese approach to global law, it's that not easily discernible. This is fundamentally because the Chinese concept of the law itself is quite hazy. So permit me, please, to investigate 2 minutes into the Chinese approach to law before I really come to Chinese approach to global law. And I would like to use a fantastic imagination applied by the Finnish critical legal positivist Carlo Tuori that every law forms within 3 structures. One is the deep structure, another is the mediating level, and the third is the surface. At the deep structure, one generally finds values specific to humans. For example, the human rights. But for the Chinese system, it's actually the civilizational values which one finds at the deep structure. And at the mediating level, one finds the social norms in application, debates and contestations of the social norms. But in the Chinese system, at the mediating level, one finds so much of distrust and skepticism about the law and the application of the law in the society. So more or less what we sense is a rejection on the part of the Chinese legal system of the laws of the system. And then through the mediating level, it reaches the surface. So surface is the place where the law manifests as law applied in institutions, the law in its normative application, or where one finds the law in action. So herein, the Chinese approach, as I've mentioned, is absolutely not normative, as it should have been influenced by the deep structure or the hermeneutical practices of the mediating level. Rather, in the Tuori model, the Chinese approach to law is what is called functional, which is a realism of sorts, which is practiced by both the United States and Russia of late. Now, to explain the Chinese approach to global law further, or to law further, Chinese legal system believes in stability and predictability, but not stability and predictability as the European tradition views the same. But it is actually rather seen as a framework within which strategic choices can be made, because every strategic choice requires certain sense of predictability and stability. So these are actually seen as advantages that will help the states to strategize its own self-interest. That means in Chinese approach to law, there is a presence of rule of law, but not as a subconscious sentiment to adhere to the dictates of the law, but rather it is mainly seen as the presence of a certain robust climate, or the presence of a climate within which the policy decisions can be taken. So China has never been ashamed of publicizing this fact that we do have stability and predictability in the legal system, but that doesn't come because of any normative reasons. It's simply a healthy strategic climate whereby the self-interest can be pursued. Now, why China has a case for rule of law? Number one, the rule of law is synonymous with order. I've mentioned that the Chinese never look at rule of law in the way the concept of rule of law is viewed by the European traditions. So, adhering to the rule of law, it helps China to build certain reputation in the international community of the states, the reputation of having a state-governed law. Second, only such markets are deemed to be robust markets which are actually rule-driven. So only then can investors be attracted to them. Interestingly, when political ambition clashes with the market, or when there are clashes within the market, all on a sudden, law assumes an objective character to establish the supremacy of the politics over there. Now, this is something very unique to the Chinese system, that when market clashes, when market and the society clashes, at the market and the politics clash, at that point, in fact, the law will assume a sort of objective character, establishing the supremacy of the political over the market. However, this is not a normative behavior. It is simply something within what we call the functional approach to law in China. So in other words, the rule of law in China is nothing but a fine sense of order rather than an order in itself. Now, Chinese approach to global law and policy, I would say that it's very rationalist. Chinese do not believe that law has to be complied with because law has something to say. The Chinese faith here is that laws are nothing but information which will help the strategic actor to make the relevant choices. So Chinese lawmakers are cost conscious, be that comes to adherence to the standards of the WTO and matters of peace and security. International law for China is an excellent mirror that reflects the defections. Well, China never sees any kind of normative pull, or China never feels any kind of normative pull towards international law. But that's a medium, however, which will reflect the defection. So China has a certain caution when it approaches international law. So here, outright violations on the part of China, no matter whether this is because of the functional approach, it may prove costly for China. So in areas of law stakes like higher education or maritime boundaries, China feels free to breach the international law, but not in high stakes areas because of the reputational concerns China has with it. But when the estimated outcomes are favorable, one will get an understanding that international law is being followed in China. Please note, the Chinese compliance with international law is simply a coincidental favorable outcome. It's not a conscious choice to comply with the commands of the law. So, national law in China gives China a sense of order, and international law gives strategic inputs. So what does the Chinese system then believe in? Because it seems like they don't believe in anything. Chinese system believes in progress. It believes in development. It believes in civilizational values. And all these the China wants to achieve through rule by law, certainly not by the rule of law. Now the summary. In China, law legitimizes the polity. And that polity creates actually spaces for political dominations to come into existence. So in sum, law legitimizes this polity that creates the spaces for political debates and contestation that are purely nationalist in character. I would like to quickly illustrate this if time permits, otherwise I'll quickly move to the Indian approach.
You have to come to that as well.
Yeah, the case of Hong Kong. The case of Hong Kong, of course, the question here is centered around state sovereignty. So what exactly is the Chinese approach to state sovereignty when it comes to the question of Hong Kong? So in China's approach to Hong Kong, one sees this horizontal allocation of power. That means that China, the sovereign, is horizontally allocating the power among the local and among the national entities. So China views it that way, not like the classic exercise of sovereignty whereby Hong Kong, the territory, belongs to China. It simply is viewed as this horizontal allocation of power. So this is something quite similar to what John Jackson, the proponent of the WTO, envisages that sovereignty model. That means sovereignty is no more that territorial or the monopoly over the citizens and the territory, but it's actually the horizontal allocation of the power. How the power will be allocated, the state will decide whether it should go to the national, it should go to the global, or it should go to the local. Moreover, the functional approach to international law which China follows has freed China from all kinds of normative commitments to that Sino-British declaration that China doesn't view that, doesn't even care for that anymore. So the Chinese relationship with Hong Kong in terms of the exercise of sovereignty is more seen as sovereignty modern, the horizontal allocation of power to the relevant actor. Now, the Indian way. Let me quickly summarize that. Well, India is a state where law schools sadistically indoctrinate a normative conviction in the minds of the students. I'm a victim of that. So here we are told that treaties have a magical pull, and you sign a treaty, you're bound by norms like pacta sunt servanda, you can never walk out of it. So that means there is a certain sanctity attached to that. But here, India is a state, despite its normative base of law, it has global ambitions. global ambitions. I mean, at times our global ambitions are unabashed. That we have actually our ambitions, which is aligned quite well with the ongoing mainstream global discourses. We followed that classic model: privatization, liberalization, competition, efficiency, etc. However, there is a mismatch here between India's ambitions and India's international law. There is actually a big gap between how India practices international relations and what exactly is written down in international law. So if India wants to establish a strategic cooperation with China, it first needs to stop viewing China through the lens of international law, which is ridiculously normative. Foreign policy probably is an ideal lens to look at China so that India can better appreciate Chinese strategic positions, and also there'll be a match of expectations. So I've said that the Indian approach to global law is more foreign policy driven, even though we at times quote international law to legitimize this. Now, that being the Indian and Chinese approach, what can be the potential areas of cooperation, or what are these common spaces of cooperation? Number one, I would say that the Chinese functional approach, that means there's space for political freedom that matches pretty well with India's foreign policy ambitions. But caution should be exercised in understanding the Chinese practice of international law from a normative lens. If India starts to judge the Chinese behavior or the Chinese state practice through the lens of normative international law, you will sense that China is a state which is very hypocritical, which often changes its positions based on it. But for China, this is a very rationalist stance within a functional framework which owes its legitimacy from politics, not really from a normative legal system. Second, there should be an appreciation of differentiation from the Indian side about the Chinese practice of international law. What I'm saying that Indian law schools should start to tell its students that international law is not always normative. States at times behave because they are better off in behaving in accordance with international law. The moment they are worse off, the states will deviate from international law. So for India, international law certainly is not the point of departure towards China. It's actually the foreign policy. From the Chinese side, the seemingly legal decisions are in fact nationally calculated foreign policy decisions. Now, the most important commonality is the globalist ambitions of both the states. Indian ambitions, as I've mentioned, align quite well with the ongoing dominant global discourse. I'm not very sure about the Chinese approach. I would rather try to believe that China believes in an integrated approach to globalization, or whether it is actually that all the peripheries are centripetally moving towards a Chinese sender in this globalization. I'm not very sure about that. Well, that's a political question which I believe I'm least competent to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Srijit, you've done great service in elucidating what you call the deep structure understanding of law and what it means in the context of China, because I'm going to discuss the two countries and what they've been doing with civil society organizations and NGOs. Here you see that there is an anecdote that says that after the party decided that law is important and governance would be using law, the story is that someone who's behaved badly, the officers sent off to take that person for political re-education or whatever, knocks on the door, the fabled midnight knock. But now that they are conscious of law, this person opens the door and says, you've got to come along with us. We have to interrogate you. And he says, but under what law are you asking me to come out? And the officers are stumped for a moment. They think and they say, under the preamble to the Constitution of China. Because that's the only place where the Communist Party of China is mentioned. So this is a kind of anecdotal thing, but it conveys that there is a sense now that you must justify. I mean, it's good to have the backing of the law, so to speak, but you're making these decisions. So for a long time, China didn't bother having any law to regulate its NGOs and civil society organizations. In any case, they were not there. For a long time, the party spun off various organizations, the Law Society, or the Engineers Association, or the Women's Association, or Association for Disabled People, or whatever. So they were all connected to the party, and they had the blessings of the party. So you didn't really get civil society organizations in the sense in which, you may say civil society versus the state in some Hegelian understanding. It wasn't there. But it began to develop when China opened up. And I sort of illustrate this in the sense that through the organization that I worked with for a long time here, long time meaning about 8 years, the Ford Foundation. When I worked in the Ford Foundation here, I accompanied Peter Geithner on a couple of occasions to China, where the Ford Foundation wanted to open an office in China. And we had these negotiations. But there was no, in the case of India, the Ford Foundation had been invited by Jawaharlal Nehru, who said that a country coming out of colonial rule is much worse off than the countries that were ravaged by the World War. And therefore, he invited Paul Hoffman, who, after the Marshall Plan and the Marshall Fund management, moved to the Ford Foundation. So he told Mr. Hoffman, you did a great job in Germany and France, helping them to recover from the ravages of war. I give you a bigger challenge. We are trying to recover from ravages of colonial rule for such a long time, so you come and help us. And he had that spirit, and he invited the Ford Foundation, and therefore the Ford Foundation was invited here. It was given a lease of land in Lodi Estate, and it was permitted to build its buildings and operate, all under the only piece of paper that defined the engagement of the Ford Foundation with the government of India are the conditions of the very first grant the Ford Foundation made, which was for community development, which was to help Mr. S.K. Day set up the institution of the block development officer. Later on in his last days, Mr. Day was ruining the fact that when he established the institution of block development officer, little did he realize that it would be an officer who would block development. But the conditions of that grant, that Ford Foundation's international staff would not pay income tax, that they will get equipment, duty-free, customs, all the diplomatic privileges that diplomats had were given for the Ford Foundation, and merrily the Ford Foundation continued. Now, we went and explained this is how we work in India, that for China it wasn't too much of a problem, because at that time they didn't have any laws, regulations, and so forth. I mean, they said, yeah, no, but you work in India with the Department of Economic Affairs. Here you work with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So they got the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and said, you work in partnership with this organization. They're going to open an office here, and they will send people to be trained in economics. That's the first set of grants that China's Ford Foundation made, send economists to Harvard and to Boston. There was a very dynamic entrepreneurial leader of the Boston University Economics Department, who got people from Indonesia, India, China. So this was it. So later, and there was a more consciousness of maybe this should be regulated. There are too many. There was no count as to how many organizations there were in China, what they were doing, and so on. Whereas in India in 1976, we've always had the Societies Registration Act. We have the Trust Act, good old British legislation under which you register, and there are certain legal obligations. You must call a general body meeting if you're a society. If you're a trust, you must go and report to the commissioner of charitable trusts what you've been doing, and so on. We had that. And we had, contributions coming from abroad. So in 76, Mrs. Gandhi, at the emergency phase, was very concerned that, money is coming from, the Urdu press in Uttar Pradesh is being divisive. It is writing communally charged stuff, and there needs to be some regulation of this. And so that was the motivation to bring the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act here in 1976, which said all organizations in India which receive foreign grants must register and give an annual report. It's not, it's just a But there was no restriction on anyone opening an office. I mean, all international, Oxfam, ActionAid, Save the Children Fund, you name it, could open offices in India. And there was no they opened offices just as Indian entities did under the Trusts Act, or as a Section 25 at that time under the Companies Act, not-for-profit company. Now the sections changed to something else in the Companies Act. Section 8. Yeah, it used to be Section 25. Anyway, so but what China did was, when I went there to work on these issues, these NGOs would tell me that they had to first, find a mother-in-law ministry. So if you're a health NGO, you went to the health ministry, and the health ministry was called by them the mother-in-law ministry. But the ministry with which you registered, there was no law really defining all this. You registered with the Ministry of Civil Affairs. And they said we carry on very well because the Ministry of Health thinks that now that you're registered with Civil Affairs will monitor you. And Civil Affairs thinks we are registering everybody, and they all have parent ministries that have certified that they are competent, and those ministries must be monitoring them. So between the two, they could carry on. I mean, one of them described it as the edge ball in table tennis. It's very risky. You could lose the point, but then it's a sure winner otherwise. So China brought a law called the Charity Act, the Charity Law, first to say you must, still with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, but defining what are the areas in which these organizations can work and what should be their relationship and so on. But more interestingly, different from India, which only has the Foreign Contributions Act, it brought a law later which came into force in January 1, 2017 for foreign NGOs, the management and administration of foreign NGOs, which required them to register again, to first register with the Ministry of Public Security. So this was changed. So security became a concern. Security was the concern of FCRA as well, but that's why foreign grants couldn't be given to journalists and couldn't be given to politicians and so on. So China got this, made the ministry, just as we have the Home Ministry administering, and Home Ministry is concerned about internal security. China brought the foreign NGOs under the Ministry of Public Security, not Civil Affairs, and then required them to have a supervising unit, some entity that they identified, several of those institutions, and said they must be your supervisory unit. This caused a great consternation and a problem for many of these foreign entities, including the Ford Foundation, because it classified you are in health, you're working in sanitation, you're working on education, you're working on irrigation, whatever, and you must find an appropriate supervisory unit that is subject specific. But some entities like the Ford Foundation work across a range of subjects. So there's no one entity they could go to and say, be my supervising unit. So they went through this process. There was a number of them had to fold up and go away. They didn't know how to negotiate this. The Ford Foundation moved away, and the CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is not in the list in the law of supervising units. So they had to find a new one. So eventually they did find one called the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Now this entity, whatever it does, is not health, is not education, is not any one, it's friendship with foreign countries. So that's the supervising unit for the Ford Foundation. So they've registered with them, and they're trying to build confidence and so on, and work. The other big point about this is that China does not allow a foreign entity to kind of spin off a national entity, right? We've done that in the Ford Foundation. the National Foundation of India was set up by the Ford Foundation because we found that if you wanted to make grants supporting, who was it, Nandita Haksar, for her work in Assam or her opposition to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, it would be blocked by the IB. So we thought this is, you're putting all human rights activists under a scanner in this country because there'll be an IB file created on them. One IB file was created on Urmila Fadnis because she got a small grant to finish her book on ethnicity in South Asia. And the IB wrote that, this is a quid pro quo with the Americans. She's known to visit Roosevelt House very often. Then we made a grant to Professor S.P. Sathe to go to a conference on human rights, and the IB writes that he cannot be expected to represent India's view in an international forum because he's a follower of S.M. Joshi. Ironically, the very week that the IB wrote this, S.M. Joshi was honored with a postage stamp issued by the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. So all of this meant that there's a file created. So it's a problem, right? So we thought, if there is an entity like completely Indian, managed entirely by Indians, give a big endowment, be done with it. So the National Foundation was created. It's another matter that the people who came into the National Foundation were all establishmentarians, Professor Swaminathan and others. So all this human rights activism didn't quite happen. There is an element of that still with the National Foundation. But that in China, you cannot do that. And foreign entity cannot create another entity and say, we've supported it, but we are not managing it, and therefore it's a Chinese entity. So there is some order now. It's still very unclear, but it's still like this, that earlier there was this understanding they're all, at the local level, you knew what they're doing. If they were not up to any mischief, they could carry on. If they caused concerns, you can shut them up. No problem. There's nothing to prevent you from asking them to fold up, pack up, and go away. But now, so it's a bit mixed. From the point of view of the civil society organizations, there is a legal framework. So there is a bit of assurance that, they are governed by something, and it's not absolutely at the behest and the report of the local party secretary whether you continue to work or not. There is now a framework. You can. The other important thing is that when we had the FCRA and we amended the FCRA, a very recent amendment was to overlook money that comes from foreign sources to political parties. Because one political party receives a very large amount of money from foreign sources, which technically would have been illegal under FCRA, but we've amended it, so now it's possible to do that kosher. We didn't consult the public, we didn't consult any NGOs, we didn't consult anybody, right? China took 2 years. Amazingly extensive consultations. With entities in Hong Kong, with entities within China, foreign organizations. So they took their time and made some changes in the initial draft. So it's kind of an interesting thing that, they form a law within no law, and then they do this with extensive consultations. We use the FCRA purely politically. And so what happened here was the Ford Foundation merrily continuing with a special relationship in India until Mr. Modi came to power. And he did not like the fact that the Ford Foundation had supported Teesta Setalvad, who incidentally is an adjunct faculty in our university. And so they said, well, how are you operating here? So the very bureaucrats who told me, no problem, this is how we've been operating. You carry on in the same way. When the act was amended in '86, I went there and I said, the act has been amended. We receive foreign contribution money. Shouldn't we be registered somewhere under this law or some other law? They said, no, you carry on. So we carried on until 2016. Then the same Ministry of Economic Affairs says, it's very puzzling. How is it that the Ford Foundation is continuing to work in this country without being registered under any law? Shut it down. So it got shut down actually for a whole year. They had to go to the Home Ministry, prior permission, just to pay the salaries of its staff. Finally, there was negotiations. The Prime Minister was going to visit the United States, and the Ford Foundation is a venerable United States foundation. You don't want to be, seen to be, in a problem with that. So there was some face saving, and from now, Ford Foundation is registered under the Foreign Exchange Management Act. FEMA, not under FCRA, right? This is all others are under FCRA, Oxfam, ActionAid, everybody has FCRA. Ford Foundation now has Foreign Exchange Management Act, and it's meant to report to, but under the Act, it's meant to report to the Finance Ministry, which was always the case. It always reported to the Finance Ministry. So my point is that, how can we say whether, in the one situation, civil society organizations are more secure in India compared to China? You can't say that. The number of civil society organizations whose FCRA has been cancelled on purely technical grounds, you were late in submitting your report, you should have submitted it within 1 year, you're submitting it in the 13th month, you're out. You should not engage in lobbying. The Public Health Foundation of India was working with the Ministry of Health in an anti-tobacco campaign. And they took away the registration of the Public Health Foundation of India, pointing out that FCRA says you must not lobby and meet members of parliament. Of course, when you're talking about tobacco and bringing laws against the use of tobacco or to discourage the use of tobacco, you will talk to MPs. But technically, it's a violation of FCRA. You're getting a grant from foreign sources. You're scheduling meetings with members of parliament to tell them about the harm that tobacco causes. That's a technical violation of FCRA. Your registration is taken away. So my question then is, whether it is in China or whether it is in India, the plight of civil society organizations is dire. Proportionate to the extent to which the state is centralized and feels that it is muscular and strong. Thank you.
My question to Ambassador Mohan Kumar. It's a very simple question. How much are India's policy choices? You mentioned the fact that India doesn't engage in plurilateralism at the WTO, for example. How much are these the result simply of the lack of capacity within the Indian Foreign Service or Indian diplomatic establishment? Many of us have been in conferences in third countries on India-China relations, where practically often no embassy official turns up from India, but the Chinese are in full strength. And maybe since you're talking about multilateralism or legal issues, how many international lawyers does the MEA have within its rank?
Then you can have your final word and respond. Take a note of the questions raised. I had a question for you.
May I just finish? I just had a question to Srijit as well. Srijit, I don't think anybody within the Indian establishment thinks of China as anything but hypocritical, or that China is anything but hypocritical, all right? And by the way, I think every nation, for that matter, engages in a...
The risk of deeming them as...
Sorry, risk of?
There is a risk of considering China as hypocritical if you view things through a normative lens.
Yeah, I don't think, some of us who've been engaged a bit too closely with the government, the policy angle that Anand was talking about, wouldn't agree that norms really play much of a role in that sense. But my question to you is this question of Hong Kong. I think you looking at it from the point of view that China, you said China is engaged in horizontal allocation of power, but I think the original fact is that Hong Kong is a separate, and since you're talking about WTO, Hong Kong is a separate entity within the WTO. There are limitations to what the Chinese can do with respect to Hong Kong because of Hong Kong's international status. So, I mean, if you were to approach it from that point of view, how would your argument change? Thank you.
Okay, so my question to you is, we don't publish a policy. There's no white paper on our development cooperation. I mean, even if it is, $2 billion and not very much, still it's the taxpayers' money, and the executive owes it to Parliament to explain how and why you're spending that money in the way you are. We don't do that. China has a policy. It's published. Brazil has a policy. It's published. Mexico has a policy. It's published. Our policy, when you ask, they say, oh, we are responsive to friendly neighbors and their needs. And then if you push further, they'll say we are not like China. And when they say we are not like China, what they mean is China will go lock, stock, and barrel with Chinese engineers, Chinese laborers, and so on, and build a palace for the president of Timor-Leste. And hand over the key to him and come away. Whereas we say, no, we do capacity building, we train the masons, if we were to go there, and don't send our own people to do it. And that's our difference. But I don't know. Maybe we built hospitals in Afghanistan with Indian engineers and Indian labor, much like the Chinese. I'm not sure if that's a big difference, but that's the claim. But my point is, why doesn't India publish a report or a white paper or a policy? Look, it's dangerous. We know what happened because there was no policy statement on coal block allocations of what happened. So it's important to publish some policy document and put it on the floor of Parliament, for propriety's sake, but also maybe substantively some MP will ask a few intelligent questions.
So, question to Srijit. Very interesting, I think, argument that you brought out. But my question is that let's take a functional area of dispute between India and China, which is the border boundary issue. And here is a direct contradiction. You have the Indian approach to treaties, negotiations, very much based from, international law, Western jurisprudence, and that successor states inherit the boundaries and the agreements of the previous one. So therefore we push our stand, which is based on the boundaries that that were laid during the British time. So the point is that if we are trying to look at solutions, and your argument that we need to approach this as a foreign policy issue, where do you take this argument forward? Because here is something that is fundamentally contradictory. But if we are looking for solutions, and you have a way in which you are assessing China's stance vis-a-vis law, and how do you take this forward? Where does it end?
Commercial agricultural practices which take a heavy beating every time India gets into any sort of multilateral trade negotiations. We are heavily getting retaliated because of ASEAN FTA, Indo-Sri Lanka FTA and everything. When will India start taking its domestic agriculturists seriously and start taking a small break in its strategic interests and trying to impress ASEAN and other nations?
Any others? Yes.
There was a time when there was a global upsurge of civil society movements and organizations. And that's when there was some concession in both India and China, but also some restriction. And right now, the restrictions are the norm. Last 2 years particularly, in both China and India. But do you foresee a resurgence or at least some change in this because the costs of enforcing restrictions on civil society when there is a global network of interconnected activities is growing, is going to be very heavy. As a result, they have to make adjustments, both in India and China.
Sir, I'm interested in knowing your views on e-commerce sector. Given that e-commerce is a very dynamic sector, you cannot predict the future. So I wanted to know your views that the stand that India is taking, not involving into talks, do you think is correct, while others are batting for global rules? Or do you think there are certain issues like data privacy and all we should stand for? Thank you.
Okay, over there. We'll take one more.
Yeah, this question is for Professor Srijit. You mentioned about the clash between political power and market trends. Can you give 2 or 3 examples of this, please?
Yes, I'll try and be as brief as I can. To Ram, right? Sorry. I should not try this. I apologize. So I don't think it's lack of capacity. I mean, we negotiated the Uruguay round literally with 2 diplomats, which is absurd. And that is not the case now. So it is not lack of capacity. We have enough people now, I think, both Ministry of Commerce, External Affairs, and so on. So it's a deliberate policy that, first of all, our commitment to multilateralism makes us believe that plurilateral negotiations undermine WTO. So that's the philosophical objection to it. The second objection, obviously, is in a plurilateral negotiation, you are not obliged to join. So we have chosen not to join. But I still maintain that the fundamental instinct for not joining a negotiation is obsession with policy space and what I call, and again, want of time and so on, but interestingly, Prime Minister Modi used a Gandhian talisman yesterday or day before. Yes. I use Gandhi's litmus test, and I think you've heard my story, but very briefly, even in Mussoorie when we joined, we are told, as a civil servant, you are not bothered about the middle class, the upper middle class, the rich people. The idea is you've got about 350 million people who live in extreme poverty, not poverty, extreme poverty. At a minimum, you think your decision should not leave them worse off. You're not bothered about, every decision, sorry? Yeah, so every decision may not benefit them, but so anyway, to cut a long story short, it is not a resource problem. I think it is an approach problem, really. So second, lawyers, we have a legal and treaties division in the MEA. It's not very big. And as far as WTO is concerned, we make use of the Advisory Law Center in Geneva, of which we are a member. They provide legal advice to developing countries. But we've also paid lawyers in Brussels and Washington for some of our high-profile disputes. They charge $1 million, actually. So that's there as well. Vijay, very simply, so the fact that we have not joined RCEP should warm the cockles of your heart. You must be jumping up and down because one of the reasons is not guys like you, your constituency. That's one of the main reasons why we have not joined RCEP, is because we are not able to face competition. On agriculture, we will have a discussion outside the room, but you don't pay tax. Farmers don't pay tax here. Water is given, electricity is given. There are issues. There are very structural issues in Indian agriculture. It's got to do with lack of mechanization, too many people living off the land. So we've got other issues. You can't say farmers are being discriminated against in this country. They commit suicide, but that's a variety of reasons. So on e-commerce, which is again a very good question, but for want of time, on data privacy now, we are fortunately off the hook because of the European data regulation. We don't need anything more than that. We can just copy that data regulation, substitute EU with India, and we'll be home and dry. Our problem is data localization, which is the requirement of the Sri Krishna Commission that regarding your critical personal data, the information must be stored in India. That's the problem. You have to negotiate. The other thing is really that every free trade agreement now talks of unimpeded data flow. which our own ICT industry also wants. That's how our IT industry grew. So now unimpeded data flow is also a bit of a problem for us. And finally, the Christchurch action, which is, hate crime and other things on social media. On that, I think people understand we're a country which has got a number of illiterate people. And if you allow, so one social media post can actually lead to riots in India, frankly. So I think people understand. So, but very briefly, that's what I...
Yeah, I know the paucity of time. I'll still try to briefly respond to the three questions. On Jebin's question, first of all, about the horizontal allocation of power. So in horizontal allocation of power, there is no uniform pattern of allocation. A state is free to decide how power has to be allocated among one local to another national and one national to another local. It can also be vary in terms of the allocation of power from national to the global. For example, China has been quite uncomfortable with this normative approach that they will get absolute sovereign power over the Hong Kong either in 1997 or they have to wait till 2047. Whereas China's sentiments got assuaged by this feeling that now there is a horizontal allocation of power, we can exercise certain control over the Hong Kong. Now when China's question of WTO was burning, China was also assuaged by the same discourse that don't worry, you are not surrendering your sovereignty to any international body, but rather you are horizontally allocating your national power, national decision-making power to an international body. It is your allocation to that body. So the same sentiment now China is applying back actually to the Hong Kong. So I'm saying there is no uniform pattern by which the horizontal allocation of power takes place. So the Hong Kong's case is simply China wants to have a self-assurance that we have certain control over the sovereignty, at least mainly, through this horizontal allocation of power. On the second question about this, where I have drawn this discourse from, well, this mainly came from a mounting concern in the international law circles about what we call the typological plurality, that today we have 3 or 4 types of international law in existence: an idealistic type, a rationalistic type, and a normative type. So when diplomats meet each other, a diplomatic with the respective internalization of international law, normative internalization, when speaking to the other state, always try to play with the norms, either tightening the norms or loosening the norms. At times, the other member may always be looking for an enhanced payoff. So, but there are situations whereby my normative tightening or loosening may coincide with their expectations regarding the payoff. We say there is a meeting of minds. In fact, there is no meeting of minds. It was simply a coincidence. So I'm saying this is exactly the problem that happens when India negotiates with China. There is again that sadistic, classic sovereign approach which India is applying in this particular case to the China's claims. To the third question, it's about an illustration about the conflict between the market and the political and a political discourse being used to legitimize that. Here I would say that on a high-stake area like investment, when a political decision has to be taken, and if there is a certain resistance on the part of the local, all on a sudden China will resort back to the normative argument that, well, the law has to prevail over. This political decision will be legitimized on the basis of an existing national legislation by applying the objectivity of that law. And I repeat that there is an international obligation being incurred here, or China wants to play actually a certain decision that favors the Chinese market, and if there is a local concern which is in antithesis to that specific political decision, then all on a sudden China will fall back on the normative argument that law is objective and the objective law has to be followed. So here, this is probably the apparent hypocrisy I talked about, but then it's not even a hypocrisy. It's something within a functional approach. And China is not the only state which is being indicted for being hypocrite. All the rational states, United States, United Kingdom, and most of the states which follow a rational approach. In India too, we see a tiny heartbeat now of that.
Yeah, so briefly, Sudarshan, your question was about why we don't have a policy statement or a doctrine governing the foreign assistance or foreign aid. The nearest I can think of, and which is not for the entire portfolio of loans and grants and credit lines of credit, but is for Africa. Prime Minister Modi enunciated the 10 principles guiding India's approach to Africa. This was in 2018. That was the first time I thought something, very concrete, and of course it doesn't relate to neighboring countries which get more than Africa, but maybe some of it is also relevant to the neighborhood, but neighborhood, as I said, is more geopolitical concerns and less so with Africa. But whatever it is, that's worth emulating and developing one for the entire portfolio. The Development Partnership Administration, I think my own view is that within the MEA there's a preference for ad hocism. They like to have some kind of freedom to decide the allocations on a year-to-year basis along with the political. Yeah, and rather than, they believe that that gives them more flexibility, they say, as opposed to being bound by a set of, a doctrine. But nonetheless, I mean, the point is, Narendra Modi initiated this in 2018. Chou En-lai gave the 8 principles governing China's development assistance in 1964.
Yeah, last point, Professor Mohanty, I share your optimism. I think it's very difficult. You may try all these things, removing registration, asking you to go away, and so on. But the world is too integrated and internationalized. Greenpeace is going nowhere. It still has influence in this country. Some IB officer writing that all these NGOs are harming and reducing India's GDP by 1.5% or whatever. All that is not going to work. There's no way in which the dynamism of civil society groups around the world is going to be halted by attempts of powerful states like China or India. And therefore, but eternal vigilance, price of liberty.